Adam and Eve. I think if you've been to church for a while, or even if you haven't, you've at least heard of these two, right? You read Genesis, you hear about the creation, about how God put everything in order and organized all of his creation and created days and nights and land and sea. And then he made man and woman, and their names were Adam and Eve. And we read further and further on about this story where the serpent shows up. And the serpent, I don't know that it's necessary that he tricks Eve. She very much makes the decision herself, but he kind of cons her into betraying God. And at that moment, sin happens. And if you go to church much, we talk about sin a lot, about how everything broke at that moment. But there's a big question that I think a lot of us forget to ask. Where did the serpent come from? Right? The serpent is Satan. Just make sure we're clear on that. That's not the point of this little thing. But where did it come from? How did it exist? We always teach that, hey, when Adam and Eve sinned, that's when the universe broke. But apparently there's evil predating that. Where did that come from? Why was evil already present if the first sin, the first deviation from God's great design happened when Eve did what she did and then Adam followed suit? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today as we study Revelation chapter 12. If you're new here, we've been going through this study of the book of Revelation. This is our 22nd week of it. And so you've got a lot to catch up on if you're new. Highly recommend at least going back and watching the first one, but really just kind of watch them all in sequence, get you some popcorn, hang out, and go through this. There's several hours worth of these studies. But we're looking at Revelation chapter 12, and we're really going to be looking at some of those big questions about evil and its nature today. Like, where did it come from? What was the origin story? How did it start? If God created everything and it was good, how did something not good show up? That's really what Revelation chapter 12 is kind of about. We're going to be looking at how really Adam and Eve's part is just the middle of this war that's been going on. And we're going to look at how it started. We're going to look at how it evolved. And we're going to look at where it's at today. So if you would, if you have a Bible, you have an app or whatever, go there, and we're going to be in chapter 12. Just very briefly, before we get into that, we got to make sure we always put ourselves back in the train of thought. Let's make sure that we don't teach something that the Bible isn't actually saying as best that we can help it. So back into the train of thought of Revelation, the first section was John on the island of Patmos. Jesus was revealing things to him. Jesus was acting as a prophet, showing him messages from God, specifically for 7 churches in Western Asia. That's what the whole book of Revelation is for. It's for those 7 churches, but by default, it's also for all Christians that will come after. Then after the first 4 chapters, we get to the worship story. And this takes place in the throne room of heaven, where Jesus is acting as the priest, the lamb, the intermediary between God and humanity. And we see the septenaries, these things that roll out God's rescue plan, God's plan to make all things right. And then last week, we transitioned to the final part of Revelation, what's called the war story. And here we're on earth again. It's a different earth than John knew, but really it's still earth. Now, there's a lot to that statement that could be taken wrong. It essentially means that John is given a future. It's not like he's not back on the island of Patmos looking at the things he was looking at when the book first started. No, this is earth, but it's different. It's future, it's past, it's twisted, it's different, all right? And the perspective is we're going to be looking up at heaven from earth during this section. And here Jesus is going to be acting as the warrior, as the king, as the leader of the armies. So today is really kind of the introduction, the backstory, how it all started kind of deal with this war. So we're going to read Revelation chapter 12, and we'll break it down. So starting in verse 1, it says, "Then a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was expecting a child, and she cried out in pain in the agony of childbirth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, a great fiery red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on its heads were 7 coronets, and its tail swept a third of the stars out of heaven and threw them down to the earth. The dragon stood opposite the woman who was about to give birth, so that he could devour her child when it was born. She gave birth to a male child who was going to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and the child was snatched away to God and to his throne. The woman, meanwhile, fled into the desert where a place has been prepared for her by God, so that she could be looked after there for 1,260 days. Then a war broke out in heaven, with Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fighting back. But they could not win, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. So the great dragon was thrown down to earth, the ancient serpent who is called the devil and the Satan, who deceives the whole world. His angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "Now at last has come salvation and power, the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. The accuser of our family has been thrown down, the one who accuses them before God day and night. They conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, because they did not love their lives unto death. So rejoice, you heavens, and all who live there. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you in great anger, knowing that he only has a short time." And when the dragon saw that he had been cast down to the earth, he set off in pursuit of the woman who had borne the baby boy. The woman, however, was given a pair of wings from a great eagle, so that she could fly away from the presence of the serpent into the desert, to the place where she is looked after for a time, 2 times, and half a time. The serpent, for its part, spat out of its mouth a jet of water like a river after the woman, to carry her off with the force of the water. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing up the river, which the dragon had spat out of his mouth. Then the dragon was angry with the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her children, those who keep God's commands and the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand beside the sea. So, this is a parable. Now, a parable is a story that has a deeper meaning. If it's a biblical parable, it's a story that has a heavenly meaning, if you kind of want to get cliche about it. But a parable is a story that has a meaning that's deeper than what's just there on the surface. So the players, the roles, the actors, the actions, they're meant to mean or symbolize something deeper than what they are on face value. And so we see this parable of this woman and this dragon going to war with each other. And then in the middle of it, verses 7 and 9, we see a narrative within the story of the parable where we see the war between Michael and Satan. So let's just kind of break it down. There's a lot of symbols here. So in order to understand the parable, we have to understand what each player and thing represents, so we can really know what Jesus and John are communicating here. So verses 1 through 4, we see a woman and a dragon. And essentially in this part, we see the woman is pregnant and she's about to give birth, and the dragon's trying essentially to eat the baby, like to kill the baby as it's being born. And so who is the dragon? The dragon is Satan. John actually explicitly says that in verse 9 of chapter 12. Like that's who this is. There's no doubt about it. He's red because red in Revelation symbolizes war. Remember the red horse. He has 7 heads, 7 being complete or full. So he is completely evil. But it also means that evil is multifaceted, that it has many forms, many faces. He has crowns on his head because he's a ruler, right? Or he's a pretender to be a ruler. And he's also the leader of an army. And then the dragon or serpent, why does he show up like this? Because this is the representation of cosmic evil, of primordial evil. This gets back to Adam and Eve in the garden. Like this every Jewish person who read this would know this, and by default Christians, that the original instigator of evil in humanity was the serpent. So he's represented here as a dragon or a serpent. And the woman, her identity is a little bit more confusing because she's a bunch of things all at once. She is Israel, she is the church, she is the daughter Zion from the Old Testament that we read about in the prophets, which is more or less an analogy for the people of God. She is the Mary, she is the new Eve. She's a bunch of things all at once. And we see that as we go through this. But she is clothed with the sun standing on the moon. What does that mean? I mean, she has influence on the whole world, essentially, right? Through her, the whole world is going to be influenced. It's going to be changed. The same way the sun and the moon have influence on the entire planet. And then she has a crown with 12 stars in it. Again, 12 represents the 12 apostles, 12 tribes of Israel. And then we see stars, they represent several things throughout Revelation. But really, like they represent either churches from like chapter 1, they represent angels of churches from chapter 1 or 2, or they represent angels themselves, as we see in the same chapter. talking about the dragon wiping a third of the stars out of heaven. He took a third of the angels with him. And so we're seeing essentially in this first few verses the beginnings of the conflict between God's people and the devil. We're seeing the conflict between God's greatest project and the devil. And so in verse 5, the child is born, and you think like, oh no, there's great danger here, but it's almost comical how quickly the danger is done away with, because it just says, oh, it's gone, right? I mean, this child is the greatest threat to Satan. We see this all the way back in the proto-evangelium. There's a fancy $2 church word for you. That word means the first prophecy about Jesus, all the way back to Adam and Eve, after God came in and settled things down, and he cursed the serpent, and he cursed Adam and Eve. He said in chapter 3, verse 15, he says, I shall put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He'll hit you on the head, and you'll hit him on the heel. All the way back at the beginning, that this child to be born is the greatest threat to Satan's power on earth. And so Satan plans to destroy him, the same way King Herod tried to destroy Jesus when he was born. But he was whisked away to a desert place. So again, we see that the woman represents Mary, represents Israel, she represents the church, she represents a lot of things, and it all works together. But that's kind of John's MO. Like, he is not a surface level kind of writer. He's not what you see is what you get. He's not a WYSIWYG writer. He is let's add a lot of layers to these things. And so the child is whisked away the moment it's born to the throne room of heaven, to where Satan can't touch him. And you might ask yourself, well, who's the child then? Like, is it Jesus? Yes, it's Jesus. She says it's the child born to rule with a rod of iron. And this gets back to another Old Testament prophecy, Psalm 2, verses 7 through 9, where it says, I shall recount God's decree. He said to me, you're my son. Today I myself have fathered you. Ask of me, and I'll make nations your domain, earth's ends your holding, and you'll smash them with an iron club, shatter them like an object made by a potter. I mean, it's Jesus. Jesus is the threat to Satan's power. And he is snatched away to where Satan can't get him. And then she is snatched away to a place of safety. Again, this is another theme throughout all of Revelation, where God protects his people. They might be harassed, they might suffer, they might die, but ultimately they're in a place of safety where death has no power over them. She is taken away to a desert place. Again, she represents Israel. Israel is brought to the promised land, where a place of safety. And she's there for 1,260 days. You remember from the past, that's 3.5 years, which is a broken 7. So this is not a complete age. This is just for a time. And then we get to 7 and 9. Now, if you read all of chapter 12 and you somehow skip 7 and 9, you would think you wouldn't miss them, really. Like, right, this narrative flows without it. But what 7 and 9 is it's the backstory. It's kind of a time jump backwards. It's how did the woman and Satan become enemies in the first place? That's really what 7 and 9 is. And this is the backstory of how Satan rebelled against God. It talks about the serpent raging a war against God. And Michael, the archangel, leads the armies of heaven against Satan and the angels that Satan had convinced to join him in this great heavenly war. And we have no details about what the war looked like, how they actually fought. We don't know anything about that. We just know that very quickly Satan lost. And after he lost, he was cast out of heaven with all of his followers, with his army. That's what Satan is. That's what demons are. They were angels that rebelled against God and lost the war because they fought against God. How that was a smart idea. He's not stupid. I can't accuse Satan of being stupid. I know I don't hold a candle to his intelligence. But fighting against the Creator doesn't seem smart to me. Anyways, they lose, they get kicked out, and he knows his time is short, right? The getting kicked out of heaven is just essentially an exile until his execution. And he is afraid of death. And so he starts a second career on earth where he attacks God's creation. He attacks the things that God loves, because he's already lost. But he's trying to ruin God's victory as best he can. And so he starts attacking God's people. And then we see in verses 10 and 12 a reminder that the victory that Michael won, it's not like Michael was the first savior and then Jesus was the second one, right? Like Michael saved heaven, Jesus saved humanity. That's not the way it works. Jesus is the savior of all. None of the victories happen without Jesus. And none of the victories happen without his blood, without his sacrifice. Jesus is the true victor. And then we get to verses 13 through 17, and we see the continuation of this narrative of Satan's second career. It kind of jumps back in a little bit to where Satan has just lost the child, so he's going to attack the mother. And so he decides to attack her again. And this time the woman is saved. And she's saved to her place of rescue. And she's there for a time, half a time, 2 times and a half. It's confusing. I can't remember. There's too many times. But essentially, anytime you see this phrase, a time, 2 times, and half a time, that means that's the suffering of the church. That's the period that the church suffers. That's the period that we're in right now. And so she's there so this is where she's representing the church. And we see again that she represents the church because after Satan can't attack her anymore, he attacks her offspring, her other offspring, the siblings of the brother, those who keep God's commandments, Christians, right? So she's the mother of the church. She represents a lot of things. It gets kind of crazy. But as she is fleeing with these angel wings or these eagle wings, the devil shoots a jet of water at her. And water represents chaos. We've talked about that in the past. That anytime you read in the Bible about the sea, about the ocean, about water, it's chaos, it's danger, it's evil, right? And so the devil spews chaos at the church. And the earth, ironically, is what saves her. And I think this is to communicate that while Satan tries to corrupt everything he can't fully corrupt everything, not even the earth itself. The earth is broken, but it is not fully corrupt, and it comes to the woman's aid. And so that basically is where we're going to stop today. That's all of chapter 12. But what's the so what here? Like, what is the thing that John's trying to communicate to those first century Christians suffering on the edge of society, suffering at the hands of the agents of the devil? By that I mean empire, Romans, their local people, those in power. It reminds me of the story of Elisha, right? Elisha is one of my favorite prophets. Not that it really matters, like, who's my favorite, but I like the story of Elisha, especially when he is a little bit later on. Elijah, if you're not familiar with the story of Elisha, he was like kind of the protege of Elijah. And Elijah is probably the most famous Old Testament prophet besides Moses. Called down fire from heaven, all that kind of stuff. Caused a drought. Like, he just did some crazy action movie stuff. But Elisha, after Elijah had gone on to heaven, literally he went to heaven. Elisha set up this school of prophecy as well, and so he's getting up early one day and he goes for a walk, and this foreign king was really mad at Elisha because Elisha kept getting messages from God about this king's attacks, and he was telling the king of Israel, and Israel was adjusting and preventing the attacks. And so this foreign king sent his army to attack Elisha and kill him. So they surrounded the city in the middle of the night. And Elisha goes out for a walk, and he has one of his students with him. And his student sees the army, and the student just loses his mind. Like, he's scared. Like, they're in this itty bitty city. It's not real defendable. The army's not there. Like, they're worried. Like, how are we going to survive this? This is a full-on attack by a foreign power. And Elisha looks at him, and he says, in 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 16, he says, "Don't be afraid. There are more with us than with them." Then he prays to God that his student's eyes would be open to the truer reality, and God blesses the student with that vision, and he can see that there are so many chariots of fire and angels just all around him. Like, there's so much more power with them than outside the city walls waiting to attack. God was going to protect Elisha. God was going to protect his people. We forget that a lot because we do suffer. We do go through hard times where the world attacks us and we lose. But the fact is, there's more with us than against us. That God is with you. He is going to see you through whatever you face, the trials, the struggles, the defeats, and even the deaths. Because in the end, Death has no power over you. You will spend eternity as part of God's people in the glorious remade creation forever, living directly in God's presence. There are more with us than against us. Don't lose heart. Don't give up. Don't be dismayed. God is with you. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, see you next week.